Welcome to the Fantasy Source Football Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, sitting here with Bill Bender. And today, the AFC East, the mighty AFC East, according to some people, although they are pretty bad at the bottom end there.
Yeah, it's SportsCenter's favorite division, certainly with the Patriots and the Jets up at the top, and certainly in the division, even though they lost to the Jets last season, I think you got to start with the Patriots when you talk about the top fantasy options.
Oh yeah, I mean, the Patriots, the one thing that you will say about them is that they might actually have too much talent. They might actually be spreading things around too much, so that nobody is really, except for Tom Brady, really is a frontline fantasy talent that you want on your team, that you want to rely on. But there are a bunch of fantasy relevant guys.
Oh yeah, that's an abridged version of a column I wrote on the Fantasy Source a couple weeks ago about New England, about how Bill Belichick seems to one year he'll have a run heavy offense, the next year they'll chuck it around. And I think it starts with Tom Brady. He's the constant. He's averaged 4,150 yards and 33 touchdowns the past 5 years. I have no problem calling him an elite quarterback, and I think he's still available in the first 2 rounds. You can draft him.
Now, he's definitely one of the top 7 or so. I think we've pretty much agreed that there's 7, 8 elite quarterbacks, and then you start playing with fire with the 9 through 12 guys as far as being able to rely on them for the rest of the season. Where in that top 7, 8 do you place him?
I'll put him about 3 or 4. I mean, you got to go with Rodgers and Vic, 1 or 2, and then I have no problem with Brady or Breeze or even Rivers in those next 3 spots. I think those guys are interchangeable, and even Peyton Manning, provided he comes back from neck injury. But the key for Tom Brady this season is going to be balancing in Chad Ochocinco, balancing in Wes Welker, and balancing Deion Branch. I think it's going to be more like the old days of Givens, Branch, and Brown, where they're going to spread it out a little bit more among those guys.
So you don't think that Wes Welker, especially in PPR leagues, is going to be quite the monster that he was a couple years ago, 3 years ago, whatever it was, when he was getting 120 receptions a year?
Maybe not that, but I still think he's going to have some value. I think all 3 of those guys, Ochocinco, Welker, maybe not Branch, but they're 800 yards, and the touchdowns will spread out from a week-to-week basis, which will make them increasingly frustrated. And I haven't even mentioned the tight ends, Aaron Hernandez, Rob Gronkowski. If they were one tight end, that's fine, but they're not. So it makes it really hard to choose between one of those guys each week.
Last 2 guys on the Patriots that I want you to comment on, BenJarvus Green-Ellis and Danny Woodhead. How are you viewing those guys going into this fantasy season?
I think BenJarvus Green-Ellis has been chronically undervalued. I know he might not get 1,000 yards, and they're excited about Stephon Ridley and some of those rookies they brought in, but I still think he's a 10-touchdown guy in that offense because he doesn't put the ball on the ground. And Danny Woodhead, he's kind of, I call him maybe a fantasy football version of a utility player. You put him on the bench, you put him in whenever you have like a lot of guys on bye week, he gets some catches, he gets some yards in the ground. He's a decent fill-in player.
Now, the team that is pretty much universally expected to either win or finish second in the division are the New York Jets. That's despite having a quarterback who for the past few years has been, I'll come out right out and say it, shockingly bad, Mark Sanchez. I mean, when you just compare him to other quarterbacks, it's kind of a miracle that they're able to produce as much on offense as they do.
And this really is a show-me year for him in terms of, you know, maybe not necessarily on the field. They've gone to back-to-back AFC title games. But for a fantasy owner, he's not a great fantasy quarterback. He doesn't have an excuse this year either because he's got Santonio Holmes, he's got Derek Mason, he's always had the ground game and offensive line, and they bring in Plaxico Burress. So there's plenty of receiving options, although the one I like the most out of those guys is Santonio Holmes because of what he can do after the catch.
Now, you think that he's pretty much a big play type guy, or is he also going to be racking up enough receptions that you might even consider him fairly well in PPR leagues?
Well, the problem is those 3 receivers, they'd be great if they were all one guy, with Santonio Holmes' big plays, Mason's possession receiving ability, and Plaxico in the red zone. But those guys aren't. So therefore, I think Santonio Holmes is more of a wide receiver 2, and then Burress is a late-round flyer, and Mason's a guy maybe you round out the bench with.
Now, the running back situation has vexed fantasy owners for a few years now, where there was that one year when LaDainian Tomlinson just basically took all the carries from Sean Green, even though everyone expected Green to get the carries, and then Green started coming on. How do you see that breaking down this year?
Well, Sean Green, that's the classic case. He was overhyped last season, disappointed, now he's being undervalued. So I think he's a sneaky good pick as a second running back because he's averaging 4.6 yards per carry in the preseason, and he has taken on the more of the lead back roles. Tomlinson's not done yet. I think he's still valuable as maybe a bench player, but as you saw last season, he wore down as the season went on.
Now, next team on the list, maybe a little bit of a dark horse in some circles, but pretty much written off as a playoff contender this year, the Miami Dolphins. Now, I, for one, have always been a Chad Henne fan. I figured, going back to his days as a 4-year starter at Michigan in a pro-style system, second-round draft pick, you got to figure this guy deserves a chance, every chance in the world to prove what he can do. And at this point, like, even the most ardent faithful have to be losing faith in him.
Well, you're looking at the big Michigan fan in the office. So I'll give Henne every chance I can, but I don't know how good of a fantasy option he is. And the problem he has in the NFL is the same problem he had in college, and that is he holds the ball a little too long, and he's a little inconsistent. The guy can still play a little bit, but he doesn't have an excuse when you have Brandon Marshall on the field. Brandon Marshall's one of the most dynamic receivers in the game.
I mean, this past weekend demonstrated in just one play, catch it on the sideline, shed a guy, stiff arm someone else, outrun everyone to the end zone. He can do that every game.
Well, the reason Henne's production fell off, too, is because their running game just didn't work last season. Ronnie Brown was a little broken down. Ricky Williams is toward the end. The Wildcat wasn't fooling anybody. So they're going to try to reignite that with Reggie Bush and Daniel Thomas, and those are two pretty interesting plays.
Now, what do you think about Bush being listed as the number one running back going into the season on most published depth charts?
I think it's interesting from the standpoint he's still not a true lead back. He's going to help. He's kind of like Danny Woodhead, but a little bit better, a little bit more flashy. He'll make that highlight run. He contributes in rushing yards and receiving yards, but I don't know if I'm not in a PPR league. I don't know if I'm going to take a chance on him, unless he's a bench running back. And then Thomas, I've told people this all week. The problem is everybody just assumed he was going to be the lead back, assumed he'd be awesome coming to Miami. He's just an ordinary rookie. He wasn't an All-American at Kansas State. He wasn't the greatest running back in the world. He's going to be an ordinary rookie. Maybe he comes on later in the season.
Now, the interesting thing that I saw about Bush that Eric Ferreira, who's in our office, and you can see all of his picks, he's listed on our mock drafts and everything on Fantasy Source. He actually posted the numbers in an email to a bunch of us about projecting Reggie Bush's receiving yards plus his rushing yards, and it basically comes out to around what you might expect from Michael Turner and Rashard Mendenhall. And then once you add in that PPR element to it, where if he gets 50, 60 catches, he's really close in points-wise to those other guys that are going to be drafted several rounds ahead of him. So, I mean, like, if you're projecting Reggie Bush to have a Reggie Bush season, then I think you can go with him. But if you think that this system isn't really going to work for him, or that for some reason he's not going to work as a between the tackles runner, or if you think they're going to try to use him that way, then you stay away, I would think.
Well, the thing you're not factoring in is the injuries. He's constantly getting injured. He's in a new system. He's not with the Saints, who were a little more explosive with the football. And a guy in one of my leagues Sunday drafted Bush, and then proclaimed it was the pick of the year, and I said it would be if he was still at USC.
Oh, that's harsh.
Which was a pretty good one-liner.
Yeah, that's not bad. I'll give you that one. Now, the team at the bottom of the AFC East, pretty much everyone's choice to finish last in the division, are the Buffalo Bills. Having written about them for Fantasy Source, I can tell you my opening line was that the outlook is grim in Buffalo, and there's just no other way around it. The thing is that they do have a couple sneaky picks for fantasy purposes, starting with Stevie Johnson, who should not really get through anybody's filters, but in some casual leads, I should say, he might.
Well, do you want better on the one-liners? These aren't your Tecmo Super Bowl Bills.
Oh, wow.
But, see, pretty good. But Johnson certainly, he is an undervalued receiver based on the fact he plays in Buffalo. I think people look at that and they say, I don't want him. Right. Well, the guy caught 10 touchdowns last season. He could do it again with Ryan Fitzpatrick based on the fact that they're going to be probably playing from behind a lot, playing against the Patriots, Jets, and Dolphins. So I think Stevie Johnson's a sneaky good wide receiver, too, that you might be able to get as a third receiver. Ryan Fitzpatrick, more of a fantasy backup. He's looked pretty good in the preseason, but you drafted him in one of our leagues, and maybe what was the thought process?
I mean, my thought process is that he is a preferred waiver wire option sort of thing. So if you get one of those 10, 11, 12 quarterbacks, Fitzpatrick is the kind of guy you'd want if you're going to have to go for 3 or 4 weeks instead of one normally. Like if I got a Phillip Rivers, I'd only keep him for 1 week. But in a draft where I get him 9, 10, 11, or if I'm worried about Rivers' health or someone else's health, then I would want to take a flyer on him later on.
Well, he does get the occasional rushing yards, and rushing yards will be a problem in this offense because Fred Jackson and C.J. Spiller, outside of a flex, they just don't excite me because of the problems with the offensive line. One player who does excite me for the Bills is an IDP option, that first-round pick, Marcel Darius. He has the look. I'm not going to call him Bruce Smith yet, but they haven't had a presence since Aaron Scoble retired, and I think he fills that need and could be a surprise in IDP leagues.
Now, they still play in the 3-4 defense, and they're looking for him to be a 3-4 end, if I recall correctly. That would be really interesting because if he is a 3-4 end, or if they're having him rush a little bit more straight up the middle as a defensive tackle type guy, then I would think that there's more value in him being in the middle as opposed to the 3-4 end.
Absolutely. I think that's where they'll start with him, and then we'll see how he projects. But you always got to be careful with rookies. Although this guy has the look, he could make a similar impact in Buffalo. Not quite as much, but a similar impact that Ndamukong Suh made with Detroit.
Hey, you know what? There's nowhere to go but up the Buffalo.
Absolutely.
All right, Bill. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.